So these thoughts have been changing time and again every day, seeing as the worldwide situation around us keeps changing day in, day out. And given that countries are still in lockdown, but people are still moving around, few people really seem to know what on earth's going on. And when you look at the last month in particular that's just gone, God. Me, this has been hard. Can this useless virus just off already? But anyway, the last month or so had seen some interesting developments in heritage railway circles. On the 12th of May, the Gloucestershire and Warwickshire announced that they would remain closed until further notice, and that all special events in 2020 would be cancelled. Therefore, unless some miracle cure happens, it looks like the Glaswalks is going to remain shut until 2021 at the earliest. And honestly, it wouldn't surprise me if other railways consider that move as a template for their own operations. To add to that, the Bowness and Kinneil Railway have just announced they're not going to open until the end of September, so that happened. But in brighter news, on the 22nd of May, the Great Central ran some test runs with the footplate crew and the guard wearing the appropriate protective equipment wherever necessary. And a local news outlet didn't take long to report that the GCR's general manager had told them that the railway was hoping to undertake further tests in the coming weeks and aim to open when government guidelines allow them to. In Europe, commercial steam is still running but on a reduced basis. The Hartzebahn system in Germany began running again in May, but on a limited service. Wolsztyn in Poland never stopped running, but that's more of a key service than a heritage one. And earlier this year in Australia, 3801 ran a few test runs in anticipation of her long-awaited return to steam. So globally at least, steam isn't really dead, it's just very limited in what it's allowed to do. But in the UK and Ireland particularly, with the amount of money that's been donated across more than 180 railways and groups, the implication seems to be that the cost of keeping these railways is high enough without even running them. And it's interesting to note that even though the bigger league heritage railways require more money and resources to see them through their furlough period, they seem to have the bigger support base. I mean, the Festiniog and Welsh Highland Railways require hundreds of thousands of pounds to see them through this downtime and had raised over $250,000 by the time Paul Lewin took us round Boston Lodge on the 23rd of May. The Bluebell got 2/3 of the way to their goal of 300 grand in just a fortnight. Meanwhile, the Cavan and Leitrim Railway in the Republic of Ireland, where the unique Avonside tank Nancy lives, only needs about 10 grand to see them through the year, but they're barely able to raise more than a quarter of that.
To further elaborate on that point, the Cavan and Leitrim had this to say as of May the 28th, 2020. The funds received to date are greatly appreciated. However, in Ireland, heritage railways are not a significant industry. We don't have a heritage lottery fund to provide us with grant aid and do not have a significant membership base. Therefore, we must struggle on. We have bills such as insurance, electricity and other maintenance bills to pay. We are looking for a fund of approximately €10,000 to cover these costs. We have raised €3,500, so have €6,500 to go. We would really encourage any narrow gauge enthusiasts in particular to help us at this time. It took 22 years to restore and fund our newly overhauled steam loco Nancy at a cost of £160,000, which has mostly been funded by our own members over that time. 2020 was expected to be our return to steam operations following a long gap of several years, subject to inspections, etc. Back to normal service.
The Pontypool and Blanavon in South Wales need £1,000 a month just to pay for insurance. Lord knows what else they need for other basic overheads like electricity or even possible extra security during this downtime. We've seen an increase in vandalism with attacks at the Mid-Norfolk, Dean Forest and Chinner and Princess Risborough railways in the last few weeks alone. So they've got more unnecessary work to do when they're not exactly allowed to do it very quickly. The Wells and Walsingham may have some form of additional security by allowing one of their volunteers to live on site there during lockdown. That's a unique story in itself, which is worth a read on the Eastern Daily Press, by the way. But few railways really seem to have that kind of luxury, and the Wells and Walsingham still need about £19,000 to see them through this whole mess. So maybe, yes, by all means support the Big League Heritage Line if that's what you feel is worth doing and if that's what's important to you. But keep in mind that the small league ones bear some degree of historical significance too. Their main issue being that their support base isn't necessarily big enough to see them recover, so the risk of them not opening again isn't necessarily vanquished yet. For the record, links to the appeals of all railways mentioned in this editorial and the Wells and Walsingham Eastern Daily Press story are all in the description below, so please give to them what you can. When it comes to restarting operation, it won't necessarily be as easy as picking up from where we left off previously. Some lines are likely to remain closed for the rest of the year, but others are more likely to look into whether or not it's worth opening towards the end of the summer in order to get some form of cash flow that isn't based on strained goodwill. Obviously, running a heritage line comes with its own daily costs, and each railway would need a minimum number of paying passengers through the doors in order to cover them. But if social distancing has to stay in place for the foreseeable future, there may not be much room on top of covering said costs. For example, to run just one round trip with a small to medium-sized loco no bigger than, say, a standard Ford tank, the Bluebell Railway, again link in the description, needs a minimum of 25 fare-paying passengers to cover the cost of that service, which doesn't take into account additional expenses like insurance, wear and tear of the rolling stock or the permanent way, funding for future projects, or indeed anything that goes towards further running of the railway. And while they could technically achieve some form of social distancing by running compartment stock so that everybody gets their own individual space, there may only be so much compartment stock that's serviceable at once. I know they have plenty compared to other lines, but even so, it's generally older, needs more frequent routine maintenance, and isn't necessarily certified to run for the 2020 season. Of course, running such a service would only cover costs if enough people risk turning up. To run 4 return services a day with that sort of minimum capacity, the Bluebell would need a minimum of 100 paying people through the doors. Any less than that and the day's service runs at a loss, but any more than that and it becomes a case of whether or not the railway will be able to safely and legally accommodate them. It's all a bit complicated. And this is before we get to the safety of the volunteers who may not necessarily be able to keep 2 meters away from each other at all times. The whole business of running a joint effort of this scale and operation requires explicit dedication, even when there isn't an invisible killer that needs extra attention to keep it at bay. It may even be that photo charters could remain marginally viable, seeing as they usually run for a limited number of participants. If the fees are high enough, the number of participants is limited enough, and said participants are responsible enough, then maybe that could provide a little extra finance for said railways while maintaining a form of operational steam presence. But that's obviously for the railways who are approached to run said charters and the charter organisers to work out, not just anybody who hasn't seen a steam engine run for over 2 months. Seeing as there's still a certain degree of animosity towards people moving around in large numbers, it's probably best not to add to any current risk. If COVID-19 has taught us anything, it's that anybody of any age can and has tragically died from it. It shows no mercies. But then the underlying question is, even if people do risk turning up, who's to say they'll be legally allowed to? By the end of May, England had relaxed the guidelines a little bit and said that you could travel as far as you like for your daily exercise, even though Cornwall authorities had still been asking people to stay away for the time being. But Scotland and Wales are still telling people to stay at home and have penalised some people for hopping the borders. The outcome is, if you live in England but volunteer on, say, the Tallaght or Barla Lake, Welsh Highland Heritage Railway, Bowness and Kinneil, or Strathspey Railway, you know the drill by now. There could still be a risk of running into trouble with the Scottish or Welsh authorities if you turn up there. And just how many of those railways tend to rely on mostly English visitors? It could be that those railways may one day be able to run a limited service, but restricted border hopping may remain by law, and those railways may find themselves short of staff, let alone passengers. So even that explains just how messy this whole thing is for the movement. It seems that whenever we can start running trains again, a balanced outlook would help to maintain a safe but enjoyable experience. And while we should all be realistic about the economics of operating railways and museums for the next year or so, we shouldn't be too dismayed about it either. I mean, Robin Coombs is right when he implies that preservation groups ought to think realistically about putting pet projects or nice-to-have ideas on the back burner and direct resources towards the bare necessities of operation in order to recover. But then Chris Price from the North Yorkshire Moors Railway and Heritage Railway Association is also right in saying that we ought to maintain a more hopeful outlook that things will, one day, return to what we're used to seeing before this whole thing blew up. It's the pioneering spirit of the 50s and 60s that saw so many closed railways rise from the ashes, and a similar thing could happen again, but in order to do so, it would require a few short-term changes in priority. So, yeah, I don't know. When we can start running trains again and start spreading a more positive social media trends like #ReturnToSteam2020, it would no doubt be the sweetest cherry on top of the terrible cake that 2020 has been. But for the sake of everybody involved, it's best that no single person rushes into this just because they can't wait to get their fix. Yeah, it's hard, it sucks. The next running day, gala weekend or rail tour can't come soon enough. But right here and now, making sure that as many people as possible are alive to see that day, that's the more important thing right now. I'm Chris, and while I can't wait to start spreading the hashtag, I'm just going to sit tight and wait patiently to see what happens next. Keep safe, everybody.